at the Capitol Rotunda because of the weather, the incredibly cold weather. But what's also interesting to note is that there have been very cold swearing-in ceremonies that have taken place outdoor. And Jim, historically, when we're taking a look at the decision-making process when it comes to whether or not to hold an inauguration, traditionally outside or now shifting inside, what is the thought process historically when it comes to determining, the events and where they take place?
Good question. Very good question. It gives us a chance to talk about this building too a little bit. When the Capitol was built, the very first building was the Senate building, which is just to the right of the big dome right there. That was the original structure that was built. And then they began to build the middle part that will be the rotunda. The original rotunda had a cap to it that was much, much smaller than the one you see. In fact, the one you see was built during the time of Abraham Lincoln. You can see pictures of it being constructed during one of his inaugurals. So they built that, and then the house was built on the other side. And then eventually they expanded the two wings, so where the Senate is now is further out, where the House is now is further out. But so in that context, these inaugurations took place in various stages and in various places. The Senate building was originally used, as was the House chamber, for the very first presidents. The first time it went outside was Andrew Jackson, and they used the east portico, not the west. The west portico is where it's been done since Ronald Reagan switched it from the east to the west, where you look down the mall and that beautiful setting that you've shown pictures of. It always prior to that was on the east side, and the east side is where you see those famous pictures of Lincoln when he's giving his second inaugural are on the east side. What's interesting is once they built this huge dome on top of the structure, it really made the pillars that were in front of the east look very small and out of place. So there was a project to redo that, and they took those pillars down. They took that facade down. And if you're in Washington and want to have some fun, those pillars are all in the National, I think, Arboretum, standing like, if you went to Rome and saw ruins and so forth, those pillars are out there. And they were replaced by new pillars and a new facade. So the facade you see with Lincoln is not the same facade where he spoke. It became much bigger and elaborate. And each president, made a decision about whether to go forward with, the exterior inauguration. When Grant was inaugurated, I think it was for his second time, it was extremely cold. It was like, 16 degrees. And he went out, nevertheless, gave his inauguration outside, but he held his inaugural ball in a room in the Treasury building where it was so cold people were wearing overcoats and the champagne froze. So kind of a famous time there. But, being the Civil War general that he was not going to take it back inside. He held it outside. And then, of course, with Reagan, it was important because by the time you get, to Trump and to Reagan and so forth, you have so many people who show up and who are in danger of having frostbite, or really some bad things can happen in situations in that sort of weather. So I think it was a wise choice to move it inside, just like as it was with President Reagan. But over time, it has been, JFK, it was about the same temperature that it is right now, 22 degrees. He went ahead with it outside. And I think the better idea is to hold it inside, and then, to not have people get injured or hurt during an inauguration.
Yeah, we're just looking at some of the arrivals yet again. Maybe we can listen to some of them here.
Jim, as we take a live look at the arrivals here inside the Capitol Rotunda, I want to ask you this, and maybe you know and maybe you don't, but we are awaiting President-elect Donald Trump to depart the Blair House and make his way here. You know, what's the process during this waiting period? What is he doing? Is he practicing his speech? Is he just relaxing? I mean, what does he do during this downtime? Or is he busy making phone calls, as we do know that, you know, he's set to sign, 200 or so executive orders. You know, can you take us perhaps inside the Blair House as we do await his arrival here?
Well, I doubt he's practiced. I bet he's read over his speech many times, and he's pretty good at reading speeches. And I think he will, he has good delivery. He knows how to give a speech. My guess is he's talking to a lot of different people and getting ready to come over. It's interesting in our history how this, presidents getting to the Capitol to be sworn in. The first inauguration was in New York at a place called Federal Hall, where Washington came all the way from Mount Vernon and rode horseback and through carriages through various cities on the way, and had all this big celebration of him coming to, to that ceremony. He gets to the ceremony. They go to give him the inauguration, and nobody had remembered to bring a Bible. They had to run and get one from a Masonic temple that he used, and that many presidents have used since because of its historic significance. He then walked over to church himself. And then when you had Thomas Jefferson, he left his hotel where he was in Washington and walked to his inaugural, the first one, and then walked back to the hotel following that inaugural. So that was kind of a important point. Later in his second inaugural, he rode a horse to Congress to be sworn in. That then followed with various presidents getting there by various means. I think the first to go in a car might have been McKinley. No, not McKinley, would have been Harding. Subsequently, this tradition developed where once the president was done with the inauguration, then you would have a parade that followed on. And those parades became more and more elaborate. Eisenhower's lasted for 4.5 hours. It was the longest. Wilson's had 40,000 people marching in it. It was the most people marching in a parade. So that became kind of the tradition of the president going back. And as you know, Carter, when he left his inauguration, was being driven back to the White House when he stopped the car, got out, and started to walk. And that became extremely famous. And I think everybody has followed that, where they walk a portion of the time on the way back to the White House. Trump did it and Biden did it. It is become kind of a tradition. It'll be interesting to see it in the cold weather, whether they'll follow that pattern or not. I wouldn't, frankly, for security and other reasons. But, this getting to there and then leaving ended up resulting in the parade that we have, because the early presidents were followed by their enthusiastic supporters back to the White House. Andrew Jackson had such enthusiastic supporters that they came back to the White House and ransacked it. I mean, they went in, punch bowls were thrown everywhere, curtains were torn down, people had to escape through windows. It was just a scene, a joyous scene. But eventually, the way they got everyone out of the White House was to take these big punch bowls outside and get the people to leave the White House.
And Jim, I just wanted to pause as President-elect Donald Trump has now arrived at the White House. President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden welcoming Trump and Melania Trump right there. I am going to raise the audio again. We might not be able to hear much, but let's listen in. I have to say, this is really interesting as we're watching President Biden and President-elect Trump standing there, apparently seeming to have a conversation of some sorts. And it's just so interesting to see the interactions, as always, as it was a very contentious, battle almost between the two before President Biden announcing that he would step down and step away from running once again for president. But, Jim, when you take a look at that moment, we did this with J.D. Vance, of course, and Vice President Harris. But what do you make of that as they paused right where that photo opportunity was, but to apparently have some sort of conversation?
The same thing I said about the J.D. Vance moment. This is good for the country to see. The unity is good. The friendship shown between two men is good. Melania Trump looked a little uncomfortable, but that's a difficult role to be in. And when the two of them went in, it looked like they continued to talk. This is reminiscent of Obama and Trump speaking at Carter's funeral too. This is a time for people to begin treating each other as not just political enemies, but as, fellow Americans. If you look over time, that interaction can sometimes be very frosty. If you look at when FDR came in 1933 and Hoover lost, they rode together in an open car with the same blanket over them to the Capitol for the inauguration, and FDR chatted away and Hoover said nothing. He was not happy. Carter and Reagan were similar. I don't think Carter was particularly chatty. I think Reagan, being who Reagan was particularly chatty. When Warren Harding won after the First World War, Woodrow Wilson had a stroke. 19 months earlier, he had tried to pass what was called the Versailles Treaty, the League of Nations. It failed. He, trying to get it passed, Wilson went out into the country to stump for it, had this severe stroke in Denver, was taken back to the White House, had another very severe stroke. And so he was very disabled at that point. And by the time, it came time for Harding to come to the White House and to go with him, they did go over together. But once they got to the Capitol, Harding kind of excused Wilson and said, I will not blame you if you don't want to come out for the ceremony itself, because he really was disabled at that point. And so Wilson was taken to his house on S Street, which is still in existence, a great museum if you're in Washington to go see. But this transition of power, this thing that Reagan talked about in 1981 as being a miracle, it really is a miracle. And it really is interesting. If you look back at Thomas Jefferson, as I told you, there was a really severe fight between Adams and Jefferson. They would later in life become friends and would write letters to each other. They both die on the same day in 1826 on July the 4th, interestingly enough. But during that time, as I said, Adams left and Jefferson went ahead and gave his magnanimous speech. So if you look at what has happened in these transitions of power, many people called that 1801 election a revolution, because it really was the first time we saw political power handed from one party to another. It was the very beginning of parties. And so people saw that as kind of an important revolution and an important development in the American experiment in democracy. And so it has been carried out ever since. And so this scene is a good scene for Americans. And let's hope that the inaugural also continues that feeling of let's unify as a country and move forward as a country. There are a lot of things that need to be addressed in this world and in this country. And, people need to work together to have that all happen.
Jim, we appreciate you taking the time to join us here on Live Now from Fox. Time right now is 10 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Pacific. And if you are just joining us here on Live Now from Fox, we are continuing our coverage of Inauguration Day 2025. This is a live look right there outside the U.S. Capitol. As we have been sharing with you, arrivals continue inside the Capitol Rotunda. In fact, this is a live look right here of the Capitol Rotunda, as we have seen family members of President-elect Trump, as well as others, arriving here, getting ready to be seated. Meanwhile, we also want to share with our viewers as well that we were sharing with you the arrival of President-elect Donald Trump and Melania Trump here at the White House. President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden welcoming them in for a tea ceremony prior to the swearing-in ceremony. They are inside the White House, media not allowed inside. And of course, one has to wonder what that conversation is going to be like. This is another vantage point there outside the White House. A very snowy ground, a very cold day, which is why in just the second time, the first time since 1985, the swearing-in ceremony will be held inside the Capitol Rotunda. And in fact, this is an aerial view right here. It keeps going in and out, so I didn't want to necessarily bring it to you full, but just a very brief look right here at the aerial view from inside the Capitol Rotunda right there. Just a bird's eye view, and you can see that folks are making their way inside. And this is a live look right here inside Capital One Arena, as of course it is a very chilly day. So unfortunately, the hundreds of thousands of individuals who made the journey to the U.S. Capitol to watch as history unfolds as Donald J. Trump is sworn in as the 47th president. Unfortunately,